With regard to Islamic anti-Semitism, it should be noted at the outset that it does not actually exist. There is only modern anti-Semitism, not genuine Islamic anti-Semitism, and there are modern Muslim anti-Semites who do, however, have some special characteristics that do indeed have something to do with Islam and its history, which we will come back to. For now, however, let us turn to modern anti-Semitism as such. Modern anti-Semitism, as is well known, is essentially not anti-Jewish racism, but a conspiracy theory, a world explanation that makes the Jews the masterminds and beneficiaries of all evil, and therefore amounts to tying the redemption of the world to the final solution of the Jewish question, i.e., the annihilation of the Jews. Anti-Semitism is a pathological crisis reaction of individual subjects and/or entire societies that promises to resolve difficult-to-bear contradictions, logical as well as social, and psychological ambivalences in thought and practice. This is why we can speak of an anti-Semitism of redemption. With Freud, one could say if a culture does not succeed in ensuring that the negatively experienced, prime costs of the civilization process, which always also means a denial of instinct, can be compensated for by the subjects by means of sublimation and material facilitation of life, an initially diffuse discomfort with and in civilization arises, which under certain psychosocial conditions turns into anti-civilizational frenzy, in the case of anti-Semitism, in the form that the abstract, superpersonal negative processes of change are given a concrete Jewish face. Elements of this can already be found in Christian anti-Judaism, which National Socialist anti-Semitism, without being absorbed into it, was therefore able to draw on. However, it, i.e. Christian anti-Judaism, still lacked the unity of an all-explanatory worldview, and thus also the claim to grasp the negative totality of a society. This, in turn, could be related to the fact that there was no such thing as social totality in the narrower sense. Only capitalism, which replaced the feudal era, would install a central and, to a certain extent, total, imperial, globalizing principle of socialization. Value, which appears as money that rules the world impersonally and abstractly. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write, "The bourgeoisie, where it has come to rule, has destroyed all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has ruthlessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties which bound man to his natural superior, and has left no other bond between man and man than naked interest, than unfeeling cash payment." As soon as the Jews are unrealistically identified with the real social synthesis, anti-Semitism becomes anti-capitalism, staging itself as fundamental social criticism. The anti-Semitic movement can be characterized as negative sublation of the capital relationship on its own basis. The almost superhistorical persistence with which anti-civilizational unease has clung to the Jews since antiquity certainly has points of reference in reality that do not rationally justify it, but explain that and why it is not historically coincidental that the Jews are repeatedly used as an object of resentment. If the classic Nazi not only persecutes the external Jew, but also always fights the Jew within, the Judaization of his own self, then this is a cranky reaction to the fact that the process of the civilization of Europe is in many respects actually a Judaization, a generalization of Judaism, which is why Freud also understood Christian anti-Judaism as a pagan defense against Christianization. And Christianity comes from Judaism, i.e. Christian Jew haters as badly baptized pagans who, under a thin veneer of Christianity, remained what their ancestors were, polytheistic barbarians. The problem is therefore not the identification of Jews and Judaism with civilization or modernity per se, against which, unlike Marx, Freud, and Adorno, critics of anti-Semitism would then have to deny the Jews their special and decisive contribution to civilization. The problem is the hostility to civilization, which in turn is based on the failure of civilization, which in turn is necessarily decided in capitalism insofar as capitalism, as a specific form of domination and exploitation, must categorically deny the happiness that it promises after all. Adorno was therefore extremely skeptical when it came to combating anti-Semitism, not with regard to the necessity of waging the fight, but with regard to its prospects of success. On the one hand, the only reasonable hope of eradicating anti-Semitism once and for all would be to eliminate its condition, its cause, i.e. the communist overcoming of capitalist society, which would fulfill the bourgeois promise of happiness. A reconciled society in which everyone could live well and be different without fear. A society which, according to Freud, did not demand more renunciations of instinct from people than were absolutely necessary and rewarded the remaining necessary ones, making them practically experienceable as worthwhile. On the one hand, practice in this direction is obstructed, which is not only due to the state of the left, including its Israel Solidarity section, and on the other hand, the wrongness of the current whole should not become an excuse not to stand in the way of anti-Semitism in the here and now. For the here and now, Adorno proposes two essentially pedagogical strategies, one short-term and one long-term. In the short term, manifest anti-Semitic characters whose personal development has only just begun, where they come out in public with words and deeds, must be countered with all state or other violence, i.e. authoritarian and repressive, not, as Adorno says, out of a need for punishment, but because authoritarian violence is the only language that the authoritarian understands and, albeit reluctantly, respects. In the long term, quasi-anti-authoritarian education would prevent or counteract the development of authoritarian characters in early childhood. The limits of both strategies lie in the fact that, as Marx would say, the educator would have to be educated himself. That, in other words, those who educate in an anti-authoritarian way and set authoritarian boundaries are themselves socialized within the wrong hole. They too experience and execute the social coldness, acquire the mental and physical hardening that is necessary on the one hand to survive in the competitive struggle of all against all, and on the other hand brings with it a certain indifference to the fate of others. The success of the work of extermination carried out by a minority of authoritarian sadists, torturers, and bureaucrats can only be achieved by the practiced indifference and the turning a blind eye of a majority that may even be free of resentment. Which is why Auschwitz can always be repeated and similar things can happen. Indeed, similar things have already happened after Auschwitz. The genocides in Rwanda and Sudan, for example, and similar things had happened before, just as the Oriental genocide of the Armenians was explicitly regarded by Hitler as a blueprint for the extermination of the Jews. For this reason, among others, it is a complete mystery to me what is so scandalous about describing National Socialism as the Orientalization of the Occident. It is certainly not original. Klaus Mann already summarized its emergence as a contemporary with the three words, "The Persians are coming," which certainly does the pre-Islamic and non-Islamic Persians an injustice, but generally means the right thing. With the State of Israel, the Jews have at any rate made their security independent of the good or bad will of others, drawing the consequence from the fact that the annihilation of the Jews will be the eternal crisis solution of capitalist socialization. That is why the Jews will protect their state and its borders even if this is considered politically right-wing, because leftists do not like the state, borders, the nation, and nationalism. In view of the international anti-Semitic hostility to Israel on the part of Brown, Red or Eco, and Islam Green parties, and the appeasement of cowards or do-gooders, it is to be welcomed that Israel is in possession of nuclear bombs. After all, this at least theoretically rules out the possibility of the world being able to watch a second Holocaust without being affected by it itself. Yes, in this sense, the idea of humanity hangs on Israel's possession of the atomic bomb. So much for modern anti-Semitism and the State of Israel as a safe haven for persecuted Jews, whose foundation would have been more than legitimate even before the Holocaust. It doesn't take long to talk about pre-modern Islamic anti-Semitism. The early Muslims privileged Jews and Christians, where they ruled over polytheists in the institution of dhimmitud and humiliated them in relation to Islam, with special taxes, special clothing, a ban on carrying weapons and defending themselves. There were also anti-Jewish pogroms from time to time in the history of the Caliphate. Jews appear in classical Islamic literature as corruptors of the scriptures and sometimes as monkeys and pigs, and a few Jewish tribes are said to have been destroyed during the constitutional phase of Islam. By and large, Islamic hostility towards Jews was therefore fed for centuries by a feeling of superiority, as a hatred of master race towards social minorities humiliated and weakened by them. If conspiracy theories existed at all, they were of little importance to the Islamic consciousness in the so-called Islamic heyday. This changed with modernity, or in fact with its invasion of the Orient. It is important to know that Islam, like no other religion and as a central social ideology or cultural authority, has linked the question of its own truth to the question of power, military successes, expansive power, the size of the area of influence, and political empire. Islam is true because and insofar as it triumphs. Modernity, however, has brought it defeat across the board. With the end of the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate, itself no longer Arab, but Turkish, collapsed, and even before that it was militarily inferior to the European colonizers. Even since their withdrawal, they have been able to get virtually nothing together, proving to be impotent in every respect. Militarily, economically, intellectually, and culturally, with poverty and illiteracy, misery, wasteland, and racist and misogynistic slavery prevailing almost everywhere beyond thin layers of rich and halfway educated clan leaders. This could have led to the conclusion that Islam and its claim to permeate social life politically had run its course, meaning that a restructuring of the traditional way of life was imminent. In its liberal form, this conclusion always had too few followers among Muslims to take root, and was ultimately unsuccessful even in its authoritarian version, i.e. Ataturk in Turkey and the Shah in Persia. Islamism responds to the Islamic identity crisis differently. The obvious decline of Islamic societies is due to the apostasy of the faithful from Islam, the loosening and decay of traditional customs, which is why their re-Islamization is presented as the solution. As this, viewed from the outside, means casting out the devil with Beelzebub, we are dealing with a successively escalating spiral of crisis, at the consequent end of which are terror of virtue and suicide attacks. Moreover, the crisis, or rather the modernity that mediated it, was not just imagined, but actually came to the Islamic world from outside, and its success could not have been achieved in the right way. Islam, which was actually superior, could only be defeated afterwards because overpowering other worldly forces such as the devil later, the little and the great Satan, must have had a hand in it. In other words, the contradiction between presumed omnipotence and real impotence is the breeding ground for conspiracy theory thinking in purely formal terms, and in terms of content for the quasi-import of modern European anti-Semitism in the Orient. These processes developed before, during, but initially completely independently of Zionist activities in Palestine. It is true that at some point there was a real moment when the Jews in Palestine appeared to the Arabs as the bearers of modernity and modernization or civilization, as the cultivators of previously useless and worthless areas of land. But it is precisely the rejection of these processes as anti-civilization resentment that is the problem. What I mean to say is that it is not the case that two equally legitimate opposing interests initially faced each other as a conflict over land, and that at some point the conflict was transformed into an anti-Semitic one. The Arab rejection of Zionism, which itself was not a given from the outset and was not hegemonic anyway, was the anti-Semitic, anti-modern alternative to the reasonable, relatively conflict-free cooperation between Jews and Arabs that still existed at the beginning. The anti-Jewish Arabs were not even concerned with overly aggressive nation-building, but with the prevention of modern nationality in any form, i.e. nothing but anti-modern and anti-civil anti-nationalism, for which they sought an alliance with National Socialism. Initially, a Palestinian state was not only instrumentally rejected by the Arabs in order to prevent an Israeli state whose territory should have been part of their own state, but also because they did not think of themselves in terms of a modern nation-state, the political form of which the surrounding Arabs still cannot quite come to terms with, and which Turkey has also been democratically dismantling for years. I would now like to briefly outline a few peculiarities of the crisis of Islamic subjects and Islamic societies. Capitalism, and even the most superficial integration of Islamic societies into the world market mean and threaten at least the disintegration of patriarchal, idyllic relations, as Marx and Engels already said. The specific nature of the course of the crisis of Islamic patriarchy, or the specific nature of the pathological crisis reaction based on this patriarchy, now has something to do with the particularities of this very patriarchy itself. The question of how a society regulates gender relations and deroots them through forms of drive regulation, alienating them from the state of nature, is not a secondary contradiction, but central and decisive for the reproduction of the respective society as such. Typical of patriarchies in general is the tabooing of sexual relations outside the institution of marriage. because the obligation of women to chastity outside marriage guarantees the male line of inheritance. What is special about Islamic patriarchy is that women, not men, are responsible for the denial of male libido. Within marriage, this means that the wife must permanently serve the husband as the object of his urges, because this one helps to prevent him from acting out his urges out of wedlock. 2. Makes him free and balanced for the interests of spirituality. And 3. Produces offspring that increase the power of the Ummah. Outside of marriage, it means that the woman must make herself invisible to all other men as a social and sexual being, i.e., if she is allowed to participate in public life at all, she can only do so in disguise. Conversely, women who are not veiled tempt men to rape them and have sex outside of marriage. And such behavior threatens to bring unrest into the Ummah, which is prevented by honor killings if they are even rumored. This logic does not, as I am often accused of by leftists, arise from a generalized Quranic exegesis carried out by me, but is executed, practically effective, by material institutions and discourses, i.e. dispositives. The Quran and its exegesis only have to do with this insofar as Islamic law, the Sharia, which forms the basis of the concrete family law that prevails in almost all states with an Islamic majority population, refers to it. Marriage law, divorce law, multiple marriages, short and hourly marriages, child marriage, state official or family state tolerated or promoted clothing regulations for women, genital mutilation, virginity cages, corporal punishment for fornication, honor killings. These are practices, quite material ones, which come into play, and where they come into play are justified by the Quran and Sunnah. This cultural imperative, this cultural dispositive, which I call patriarchal phallocentrism, in the sense that everything revolves around the promotion of male potency, that is, the responsibility for the Islam-compliant relationship between the denial of male drive and the rejection of male drive is placed on women, a power, which in turn can be desired by women as a gratification and oppression, and, incidentally, also sexually, making them not only victims but also perpetrators of crimes against daughters and sons. This phallocentrism rests on the marital barter of female obedience for male maintenance. It should therefore be obvious and easy to understand that this system comes in a crisis at the latest when young men, for example, no longer have the material means to afford marriage due to mass unemployment, but at the same time the traditional sexual morality is clung to all the more doggedly. This means that even the slightest deviation from the norm is punished much more severely, and norms are enforced much more rigorously and consequent than in times when the traditional regulation of sexual drive was not fundamentally questioned in and through practice. Every woman who is insufficiently or not at all veiled and desexualized now becomes a threat to male conformity to the rules, a temptress to transgression, an ally of Satan, a threat to the Ummah incited by the Jews. In the process, the male body with its natural needs and its seductiveness also becomes a problem. This is why in the rampages against unruly women, gays, Jews, Christians, or simply Westerners, i.e. the seductive decadence, the sexual nonconformity that they live and propagate from the perspective of the pious Muslim, their own death is always taken into account or even explicitly sought from the outset. If martyrdom, the disembodiment of the unclean body, is rewarded for many in the end by being able to have unlimited sex with 72 virgins who renew themselves after each act, this stands on the one hand for the negative sublation of traditional phallocentrism on its own basis, and on the other hand for the perverse sexual dimension of the delusion that the otherworldly reward of the earthly struggle should consist in the distortion of that which is fought against on earth. Without wishing to establish a ranking of evil in the following, it is only by reflecting on the archaic traditional gender relationship that one can grasp that and to what extent the frenzy of the Islamist professes sadistic bestiality much more openly, i.e. without mediation or attempts at concealment, than the National Socialist model. The National Socialist orientalization of the Occident was a leap in civilization from civilization and in the midst of civilization. Since that level of civilization had never been climbed in, and by the Orient, the inhibition thresholds for immediate and rawest violence are much lower in the masses, which is why bloodthirstiness can be successfully advertised among them. It is downright ridiculous when the excessive killings and the most recent cases of honor killings that have come to light are received as dramas of jealousy in relationships. An individual's psychotic murder and bloodlust may have been at work in one or the other perpetrator, but one should never forget that the perpetrators often also see themselves as publicly punishing judges who want to signal to other unruly women what is in store for them. There are three very specific groups of people who have been increasingly attacked by Muslim men in recent years by means of physical violence, up to and including violent excess and bestial murder, sometimes in public: Jews, women, and gays. More abstractly, Christians or Western civilians in general are also the target of terrorists. As a problem of Islam and integration, a substantial challenge to civic life had long been on the rise before Merkel's refugee policy exacerbated the situation. And not mainly because terrorists were able to cross borders unchecked, or because a few 100,000 people who are hostile to the society they are migrating to would be a major unsolvable problem in themselves. Rather, it is because, as Hannah Arendt already pointed out in Principle, Jan Gerber explained this at the Bahamas Conference in May, which will be published in the upcoming Bahamas. Refugees can have a disintegrating effect on only half-integrated or poorly integrated migrants from previous years and decades who come from the same cultural background. Thus, the Islamic counter-society is not only growing through Islamist refugees themselves, but also through migrants of Arab and Turkish origin who are breaking away from the majority society in the course of self-ethnization and self-Islamization. A misguided refugee policy is thus reinforcing an integration policy that has been misguided for almost eternity, in which a clear idea of what should be integrated into has been increasingly lost. Although I am of the opinion that measures such as more restrictive border controls, deportation of certain groups of people, a return to the individual right of asylum in combination with immigration according to criteria, video surveillance, border bollards at Christmas markets, making intelligence and police work more effective, and the like, let's say, right-wing populist issues could also be discussed soberly without automatically using so-called Nazi discourse. This has demonstrably never been my thing, and it is not today either. The only realpolitik proposal that my criticism of Islam has ever led to was and is a ban on headscarves for schoolgirls or a ban on headscarves in all state authorities. My arguments for this have always been more traditionally left-wing, i.e. anti-racist and feminist in a sensible sense, because this is about the civil rights of migrant women, which are violated by the headscarf in an individual, practical, and socially symbolic, aggressive, and promotional way. Because it undermines and counteracts any education of native and migrant girls and boys to become sexually self-determined citizens. The headscarf on girls is tolerated during this instruction. Since the Islamist racket puts pressure not only on girls and women, but also on liberal fathers and mothers, I argue, a state ban would also support the right people in internal Islamic struggles and not the wrong ones, as is the case now. Since the entire Islamic sexuality dispositive, including the concept of honor, is symbolically and practically condensed in the headscarf ban would be a first and decisive step towards dissolving the fatal connection between honor and shame, and thus also towards avoiding a specific identity crisis that manifests itself in specific crisis resolution strategies. I'm not saying that this would solve all problems overnight. I'm just saying that it would be the beginning of a long-term non-Islamist socialization, the dismantling of a counter-society, and making it clear where the local society sees its own essential achievements. So much for the first part, in which I try to point out the particularities of Muslim anti-Semites in terms of their awareness or crisis management, and the forms of expression that are quantitatively and qualitatively more threatening to Jews at the moment than those of classic right-wing anti-Semites, in which I wanted to point out the connection between Islamic hatred of Jews, women, and gays, which is based on the crisis of a certain type of patriarchy, and that the whole thing should be answered above all in terms of integration policy, with reference to indivisible civil rights. I will begin the second part with two speeches that were given in the German Bundestag with which I largely agree. The first dates from January 18, 2018. The installation of an anti-Semitism commissioner was discussed, and the second from April 26, 2018. The official aim was to reaffirm and intensify friendly relations between Germany and Israel on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the state. The first speech went like this. Anti-Semitism in any form is a disgrace, and anti-Semitism is an attack on our Jewish citizens. It is an attack on the foundations of our Western civilization. This civilization stands on a Judeo-Christian foundation. This motion rightly emphasizes that anti-Semitism can be found in all political camps. We in Germany have a very special responsibility due to our history, and we expressly acknowledge this. However, our special responsibility also includes not turning a blind eye to the new quality of anti-Semitic attacks in Western Europe. The second report of the Independent Expert Group on Anti-Semitism is helpful in this respect. On behalf of the Bundestag, this group has investigated anti-Semitically motivated crimes and surveyed Jews in Germany. I quote, "When asked what kind of person or group committed the category of Muslim person/group is mentioned by far the most frequently, followed by person unknown to me. Only then do left-wing extremist and right-wing extremist person/groups follow in equal numbers. The fact that police statistics do not reflect this may be explained by an example from Berlin on July 25, 2014. National Socialist slogans by the Shiite Hezbollah against people carrying Israel flags on the fringes of the Al-Quds March were recorded in PMK Rex, i.e. as right-wing extremist. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest. Statistics that record crimes committed by Islamist terrorist militias as right-wing crime are useless. They disguise the fact, but at some point reality catches up with you. In France, for example, the reality is different. Since 2006, a total of 40,000 Jews have emigrated from France to Israel alone. They have fled from terror and the daily attacks and threats. They are refugees that nobody talks about because they are fleeing from Muslims. This is the present in France. Of course, not all Muslims are the source of this terror against Jews and people of other faiths, but there are far too many of them. When Israel flags are burned in Germany or Jewish schoolchildren are bullied by their classmates, when Jewish citizens have to fear wearing a kippah in public or institutions have to be monitored by the police, then that is unacceptable. But there are other ways. Now it's getting weird, but I'm still reading it. I was in Hungary last May where I visited a Jewish center. It didn't need to be protected by the police. The doors were open. The children were playing in the street. The boys were wearing kippahs. Viktor Orban wants it to stay that way. This also explains his stance on the refugee issue. He has announced a zero-tolerance policy against anti-Semitism. That is why Hungary is also receiving support from Israel." End of quote. I quote from the second speech. "We welcome the fact that the German government declares its commitment to Israel's right to exist and acknowledges this in its motion. However, this would be more credible if the federal government did not at the same time finance hatred of Jews and hostility towards Israel in the Middle East with millions of taxpayers' money. UNRWA, the controversial UN aid organization for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East, is practically part of Hamas infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. In UNRWA schools, Israel's right to exist is consequently denied. The State of Israel does not exist on maps in UNRWA school textbooks. Israel only appears with the Palestinian flag, and cities such as Tel Aviv are not shown at all. Martyrs, i.e. terrorists and suicide bombers, are glorified as heroes. UNRWA teachers from the Gaza Strip, Syria, and Lebanon celebrate the 10 best quotes from Adolf Hitler on Facebook. They deny the Holocaust and publicly demand, "Kill the settlers." These are just a few of the dozens of examples compiled by UN Watch. So if you're wondering where the hatred against Jews and Israel comes from, here's the answer. That's where it comes from, co-financed by German taxpayers' money. While Donald Trump has frozen payments for this reason, the German government has continued to increase German payments. Since the Chancellor took office, payments have risen from 3 million euros to 80 million euros. We clearly reject this. Martin Klingst wrote in Die Zeit on January 22, 2018. UNRWA has become an octopus. Founded to solve an urgent problem, the aid organization is now a problem itself. The German government's failure to act has serious consequences. The radicalization caused by indoctrination in UNRWA schools is bearing sad fruit. The founder of the March of Return movement, Issam Hamad, has announced that millions of UNRWA refugees will march to the Israeli border in May. If Israel protects its borders, Hamas is threatening, literally, a third world war. The future of Israel depends on the protection of its borders. A world of open borders is incompatible with Israel's right to exist. Ladies and gentlemen of the federal government, don't just make speeches. This is particularly true here. You cannot deplore anti-Semitism with big words on the one hand, and at the same time, give 80 million euros to those who want to wipe Israel off the map. Chancellor, that is a complete lie. Follow Donald Trump. Suspend all payments to UNRWA until it is ensured that not a single cent is spent on Jew hatred or goes to Hamas terrorists. Israel's right to exist is not abstract at this point. It is very concrete. The world will judge you by it, and so will we. End quote. With a few exceptions and on the essential points, these speeches give the impression that Alex Feuerherd or Stefan Grigget have translated some of their most important interventions of recent years into politicians' German and acted as speechwriters so that some of the very important things they say will actually reach the Bundestag. This was not the case. It is also not the case that Sebastian Voigt and Bach Shalom succeeded in bringing the Left Party as a whole, or even just its parliamentary group in the Bundestag, onto a consequent course of solidarity with Israel and criticism of anti-Semitism. That is why the speeches by Beatrix von Storch of the AfD were applauded by the entire parliamentary group. And speeches like this are no exception. Gallen's speech was also discussed in Leipzig. Before the AfD took office, there were no such pro-Israeli and anti-Semitic speeches in the German Bundestag, and certainly not shared by the entire parliamentary group. The important points: 1. Anti-Semitism is an attack that, on the one hand, refers quite specifically and exclusively to Jews, but in this it also simultaneously targets the foundations of civilization, which is Judeo-Christian, and thus has every citizen or their order in its sights, which is why the fight against anti-Semitism is. 2. Is not to be waged solely paternalistically to protect Jews as a minority alongside others who have special problems, but is the task of every citizen, also for their own sake. 3. The greatest potential for anti-Jewish violence is not represented by autochthonous right-wing radicals, with whom anti-Israeli left-wing radicals are on a par anyway, but by Muslims. 80% of those who were physically attacked stated that the perpetrators were presumably Muslim. 4. Anti-Semitic and pro-Israeli lip service. All forms of fatalism and hypocrisy should finally be put to an end, and this is possible if the appropriate political consequences and actions are taken, which of course requires a corresponding will. On the last point, I am of course aware that Hungary and Orban are not really good examples. It is doubtful that the Hungarian stance on the refugee issue is primarily based on a defense against anti-Semitism. However, pointing out that Judaism is lived much more openly and visibly in Eastern European countries than in Germany, and that, unlike in Germany, Jewish institutions do not have to be under permanent police protection, is in any case correct and especially important in Germany, because the need for police protection for Jewish institutions is fatalistically accepted here as a reality that cannot be changed, i.e., it is no longer pursued as a goal, and it is discussed that this could be different in the future and how it could be made to be different, and at the same time one acts as a moralizer towards Eastern Europe. Following Trump's example with regard to Israel, freezing all funding for UNRWA or moving the embassy to Jerusalem would indeed be the least that could be demanded if politicians' declarations of solidarity with Israel were to be taken seriously, as they would certainly have the power to do so. Let me conclude. The leftists in Israel solidarity, who have tried to integrate Israel solidarity into classic anti-fascism, are now also, and at the same time, turning to classic anti-fascism against the AfD, and thus against the only party that is in solidarity with Israel, critical of anti-Semitism, and at least as far as the Muslim patriarchy is concerned, critical of patriarchy, because they are inflating it into a folkish pop dance, which at worst corresponds to the state of the CSU 20 years ago. And they are once again officially or informally collaborating with the left-wing cartel that is responsible for the AfD's successes and whose pro-Islamism and anti-Israelism should be denounced in the first place. The only halfway consistent thing here is the positive reference to the word left. Otherwise, however, the insistence on left-wing identity means that solidarity with Israel either no longer has any priority or becomes inconsistent and contradictory. At the very least, it is not clear to me, and this is my conclusion, why it should be a sensible strategy to fight with left-wing anti-Semites against right-wing solidarity with Israel.